Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Dr. Lipsedge, again, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I'm going back to your 2022 article, and I think for those of us in the room, we'll see at the very bottom of page 4 of the article that you make mention of something, and I think you mentioned this earlier in your evidence. In the United Kingdom, as early as 2004, a Metropolitan Police review recognised that the term excited delirium ought to be removed from its documentation following a coroner's warning that its use encourages failure to recognise the multifactorial pathophysiology of deaths following restraint. And that was a quote from the Metropolitan Police Service in 2004. Is that the thing you mentioned earlier in evidence?
Yes, I think it is. That followed the death in custody of Roger Sylvester.
And so as early as 2004, the Metropolitan Police Service were acknowledging the issue. Right. And then
Yes.
Moving on to page 5, I see in your article that you mention the Braidwood inquiries. And this was a death in October 2007 involving the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and a death at Vancouver International Airport. And you describe this at the end of that first paragraph there. These inquiries conducted in 2009, 2010 represented a major turning point in the excited delirium story. Could you help the chair understand what this major turning point was?
Essentially, this is to do with an inquiry into the death of a Polish visitor to Vancouver who arrived in the airport and he was rather confused and disorientated, didn't speak English, and couldn't see his family who were meant to be there to welcome him. And he became rather agitated. And the police really overreacted to his agitation. And I think he was restrained, and I think CEW, i.e. taser, was used, and he died. And there was an inquiry which was led by Judge Braidwood, who's a very senior judge in British Columbia. And he condemned the use of the term excited delirium. Witnesses on behalf of the police attributed the death to so-called excited delirium. The judge wouldn't accept that. And there was a very important witness who'd worked for the police for over 20 years. He was a psychologist whose name I've just forgotten, but it's mentioned.
Is that Dr. Webster? You mention in the article a Dr. Webster who gave evidence.
Yeah, and Dr. Webster revealed how revealed how taser, which is now called Axon, had been promoting the use and the concept, the use of the term excited delirium and the concept, and were very keen to educate police forces about it. Really, the way Dr. Webster interpreted this, and I think Judge Braidwood as well, was that the more people, especially law enforcement officers, were aware of excited delirium, the more likely they were to use a taser. So it was really the judge and other witnesses were drawing attention to the use of this term and the excessive use of the term to account for deaths in custody when other factors should have been taken into account.
And I think in your article, we can just see at the bottom of the page, we can move that up slightly, that you quote from Dr. Webster and say he told the Braidwood inquiry that as a result of Axon or Taser's efforts, this was the company involved with the CEW, or the conducted energy weapon, which you've described as a taser. And Dr. Webster said, police and medical examiners are using the term excited delirium as a convenient excuse for what could be excessive use of force or inappropriate control techniques during an arrest. And does that sum up what Dr. Webster said to the Braidwood inquiry?
Yes.
And then I think that you then explain what the decisions were from Judge Braidwood, and you explain the litigation started by Axon and Taser as a result of Judge Braidwood's decisions.
Yes, Judge Braidwood was challenged by Taser on the grounds that he didn't have any scientific understanding of the subject, and Taser Axon, they were overruled on that matter.
And you say the Supreme Court dismissed the challenge, and you give the reference to the case in your article.
Yes.
Right. And then sorry.
Well, I was going to say the reason Terry McGuinness and I see that as a pivotal moment is it was when it was the Judge Braidwood inquiry really very publicly discredited the term excited delirium, certainly within Canada, but it continued to be used within the United States. And it was after that the American College of Emergency Physicians produced their white paper, actually in favor of what they called excited delirium syndrome, and they ignored or defied the Braidwood judgment. And
I think you deal with that on page 6 in your article and explain the American College of Emergency Physicians approach, and they instituted a task force to look at this after Judge Braidwood's inquiries. And is that the organisation, are they known as ACEP?
That's ACEP, yes.
ACEP.
Yeah. They've recently produced a revised account of what they used to call excited delirium. They've changed the name, but essentially they're describing a similar clinical picture. I may have mentioned this morning, I think I did. I think the reason that emergency physicians, whether in America or in this country, have a different view, say, to psychiatrists of disturbed people, is that emergency physicians only see people who, by definition, are in a very, very severely agitated state, whose physiology is likely to be deranged. Whereas as psychiatrists, we see people who are agitated and upset, but whose physiology is not at risk and who need a sympathetic approach rather than a rigorous medical approach. I think that accounts for the discrepancy between the emergency physicians and psychiatrists.
Right.
And
Let
I
me.
would like to I would like to emphasize that that's the basis of the misunderstanding. That the emergency physicians, by definition, see very, very ill people, and we see a spectrum, which includes, at the most benign end of the spectrum, people who are distressed and upset, but who aren't at risk of a fatal outcome from disturbed physiology.
Thank you. And I think in your own inquiry statement at paragraph 64, you do mention the American College of Emergency Physicians, and you say they've stopped using the term excited delirium, and they've simply replaced it with a similar term, hyperactive delirium.
Yes.
Is that the term that you were referring to there?
That's right. That's
and
right.
you say they haven't climbed down from their attitude to excited delirium, in spite of the American Medical Association condemning the term and everything it implies. And then
yes,
I think
absolutely.
In your inquiry statement, you go on to say, in the UK, my understanding is that the Royal College of Emergency Medicine is moving towards the sort of view that I've expressed regarding excited delirium, but I think there's still some resistance, and this might be because emergency physicians see severely disturbed people being brought in by ambulance or by the police who need urgent life-saving measures. Some of them die, and the cause or causes of death are not immediately apparent. And so is this this is what you're referring to in this paragraph?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
And I think that the Royal College of Psychiatrists, Royal College of Emergency Physicians should not be in dispute about this. It simply requires a recognition that the emergency physicians are seeing the extreme end of the spectrum. Whereas as psychiatrists, we see a whole range of people who are in very obvious distress.
And in terms of the work that you did as part of the working group for the Royal College of Psychiatrists, that hope and encouragement to have organisations speak to each other and reach a concurrence and an agreement, is that something you would hope any differences between the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the Royal College of Emergency Medicine that gap could be bridged?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'd advocated that in my 2015 critique of excited delirium, when I'd recommended that because there was obvious misunderstanding between the disciplines of the term excited delirium, I suggested that coroners and medical examiners and pathologists and other professionals should establish a dialogue to work out a reasonable terminology and an approach to highly disturbed people.
Thank you. And then in your article, you've recognised the divergence of views between America and the UK, for example. You also talk about greater scrutiny in Europe, and you describe 2 reports published in 2017 which cast further doubt on claims of deaths due to excited delirium. And you mention the use of restraint by police forces in the UK featured prominently in Dame Ailish Angelini's report on deaths in police custody, and a review that was commissioned by the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, in 2015, after meeting with families of Sean Rigg and Olaseni Lewis.
That's correct.
And both had died after restraint by the police.
Yes. And there are 2 points that stand out in the Angelini report. One is that she condemns the use of the term excited delirium, and secondly, she condemns the use of prone restraint.
Right. And you've detailed her recommendations and her views in your article, and you say she also called for the term to be removed from guidance to police officers.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. And then I think earlier today you were talking about percentages of deaths, and I see on page 7 of your article, towards the bottom of the right-hand side, you say, although the ASEP task force had recommended that a diagnosis of ED be based upon evidence of perceived abnormal behaviour, and at least 6 of their 10 potential clinical criteria for such a diagnosis, a team from Lausanne University Hospital who reviewed matters found many patients had been diagnosed with excited delirium despite presenting with fewer than 6 of the diagnostic features. And is that something that you mentioned earlier in evidence today?
Yes, fewer than 6, and in some reports just a single feature.
And you go on to say the most common features, including claims of superhuman strength, bizarre behaviour and unusual pain tolerance, did not appear with equal frequency and appeared not to be mandatory. So not mandatory parts of the criteria. And
exactly.
You concluded the prevalence of excited delirium also appeared to vary widely with context. Is that an indication of the lack of standardized criteria, or just in general?
Yes, two points. Yes, lack of standardized criteria, or the fact that the criteria could be very subjective. For example, how do you gauge tolerance to pain? The other thing is that you use the word context. That's very important, and a subsequent paper by Stromer, Ellen Stromer, which came out a year or 2 later, in which she emphasized, she reviewed all the case reports on excited delirium in the literature, and she established that the term excited delirium as the cause of death was only used when what she called aggressive restraint had been used. So the context was aggressive restraint leading to death, and at that point the cause of death would be excited delirium. And that was an extremely thorough review of all the available literature.
Right. And Stromer is also mentioned in your article, and the...
Yes.
Yes. We see that at the bottom of page 7. And then you also comment, whilst cases requiring out-of-hospital restraint were observed in fewer than 2 cases for 10,000 emergency calls for advanced life support, excited delirium was associated with more than 10% of deaths in police custody and said to represent more than 10% of CEW taser-related deaths. And I'm interested in the distinction there in the figures and the statistics. Observed in fewer than 2 cases for 10,000 emergency calls, but more than 10% of deaths in police custody.
Yes. Indeed. So, and then Stromer breaks down what happens in police custody, and she divides restraint methods into, quotes, aggressive restraint methods, which in the American context meant neck holds, choke holds, hobble position, hog tie. So she calls those aggressive methods of restraint from more gentle methods of restraint. And excited delirium, as a cause of death, was pretty well invariably linked to the more aggressive methods of restraint.
Mm-hmm. And you also say on page 8 of your article, the absence of a clear, consistent definition has made it difficult to estimate the incidence of excited delirium and has prevented a consensus emerging as to its mortality rate. On the one hand,
yes,
there is a conviction that people presenting with these signs were always doomed, unable to alight from the freight train of death. And you talk about that being seen in certain publications from Vettel, Mash and Karch. I'm interested in what it means, this freight train of death.
By that was their term, and they that once you're in an excited state, then you're going to die anyway, regardless of the way you're treated.
And that's the view of people who support excited delirium being used as a cause of death.
Absolutely. So the death rate in excited delirium from the proponents of excited delirium was claimed to be between 100% to 10%, roughly, which seems absurd.
Right. And then you talk about the future. This is in your 2022 article. And at the bottom of page 8 on the right-hand side, you say, the American Psychiatric Association Board of Trustees adopted a position statement in December 2022, which declared that excited delirium should not be used as a diagnosis because it's non-specific and lacks clear diagnostic criteria. And the statement noted that excited delirium had been invoked to explain or justify injury or death to individuals in police custody, and that the term is disproportionately applied to black men in custody. And that's something that you mentioned to us earlier.
Yes.
And then you talk about the position in England and Wales at that time. Now, you've also talked about the Royal College of Emergency Medicine in the UK and their apparent moving towards a change in position at this stage as well.
Well, they've abandoned the use of the term excited delirium. They've adopted the term acute behavioral disturbance, which is a good move, but there is a danger, and this has happened in one or two inquests. Specifically, the one I can think of is Kevin Clark, where pathologists have proposed that the cause of death during restraint in a psychiatrically ill patient was acute behavioral disturbance, whereas the evidence was accepted that it was faulty restraint that led to his death. So that we are concerned. It's my concern. I know that the charity inquest is concerned and other people are concerned that ABD, acute behavioral disturbance, might be used in the way, almost as a synonym for excited delirium, as a cause of death in a way that minimizes the contribution of faulty restraint.
I'd like to move on to page 9 of your article, which covers your conclusion. And I'd like to read part of it out and then ask you some further questions about this, if I may. Because you say you recognise the risk that the term, and this is towards the bottom of the page on the left, we recognise the risk that the term acute behavioural disturbance might be misused at inquiries or inquests as a proxy for excited delirium, to downplay the role of faulty and negligent restraint. We're concerned that at the recent inquest into the death of Kevin Clark, a 35-year-old black man who was experiencing a severe mental health crisis in a public place, the jury recorded the primary medical cause of death as acute behavioural disturbance in a relapse of schizophrenia, leading to exhaustion and cardiac arrest, contributed to by restraint, struggle, and being walked. We would tentatively suggest ABD's replacement with an adjectival description such as severely agitated person in distress. So SAPID, severely agitated person in distress, could be used as an emergency services call sign. Like excited delirium before it, the misappropriation of the term acute behavioural disturbance must not be allowed to downplay the threat that faulty restraint poses to life in these highly challenging situations. I'm very interested in hearing more about your use of this, if I can use the acronym SAPID, severely agitated person in distress. Could you tell us why you think that would be a better description or better terminology than excited delirium or ABD?
This was an acronym that I thought could be used as a call sign to draw attention to the individual person as being a person in distress, rather than emphasizing a condition. The sort of the legacy of excited delirium is that there's a suggestion that there's a specific entity which in itself can have a fatal outcome. As opposed to what I would prefer, and I think the college would prefer, College of Psychiatrists would prefer, is an adjectival description, a more humanizing description of what we witness in a person and what a person is experiencing, as opposed to a diagnostic entity. So, and I am talking about the, as it were, benign end of the spectrum, in which a person can become severely distressed when they hear bad news or something goes seriously wrong in their personal life. And so what we witness, what we see, is not a condition, not a diagnosable condition, but in everyday human life terms, a person who's extremely upset and distressed. I think that's the advantage of that acronym SAPID. It replaces an alleged diagnostic entity with a description of a human being in distress.
So moving away from the idea that excited delirium or ABD are conditions that can be diagnosed, and putting the focus on the person.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. I'd like to move on and ask you some questions. You've already touched on this morning when I was referring to your original report to PERC we talked about the state of mind of a person who's taken alpha PVP, MDMA, who's becoming agitated and perhaps psychotic, and you gave your diagnosis in your original report of the intoxication that person is experiencing. We talked about the state of mind of that person, and in particular Mr. Bio, when he was at his friend's house, becoming paranoid. And we also talked about the state of mind when he was involved in the altercation, the fight with his friend.
Yes.
And I'd like to ask you for your comments about the state of mind of during different phases of the events. We've obviously heard a lot of evidence in the inquiry from eyewitnesses and civilians and police officers. We've heard evidence from a pathologist, and we've heard evidence from experts. And I wonder if you could help the chair understand the state of mind of Mr. Bio when he was walking through the street, said to be seen to be brandishing a knife, chasing cars, walking in I think you described earlier, in a confused fashion. And then I'd like you to explain the state of mind when the police arrive. So we've heard evidence about the arrival of the police, vans, police vehicles arriving, officers in full uniform, sirens, klaxons, and some of the officers shouting commands. And can you give the chair any additional information about the state of mind of a person when that takes place, when the police arrive at the scene?
If a person is in a paranoid state, as I defined it this morning, that's to say, a person whose thinking is dominated by imaginary enemies, by the idea that other people are out to harm you or kidnap you or torture you, then you're highly suspicious of other people, including people in authority. Now, I don't know Mr. Bio's previous experience with the police, and he might not have had any previous experience, but sometimes the appearance of somebody in a uniform exacerbates a paranoid state, whereas a person appearing as a civilian might be potentially reassuring. I think I must mention ethnicity. I know that Scotland has a more tolerant reputation than England when it comes to racial prejudice, but it's possible that Mr. Bio had experienced discrimination, and that might have been a factor when he was approached by white police officers. I simply don't know that. That's speculation, but that has to be considered. I think, I hope that answers your question. The other thing I'd emphasize is that in this drug-induced confusional and paranoid state, a person's attitudes fluctuate and level of disturbance fluctuates. This must be to do with what's going on in biochemistry and neurochemistry. So we know that he had what seems to be a reasonable conversation with a neighbor, Mr. Morgan, which was very, very different to the serious fight that he had with his best friend. So that has to be taken into account, the possibility of fluctuations in his degree of confusion, his misinterpretation of what was going on around him, and how he understood other people's intentions.
The chair has evidence available to him by way of a statement from Mr. Bayo's friend, Mr. Sahid, who talks about Mr. Bayo's behaviour switching. He uses the word switched, and his body language become different. He described it as he would become quite sturdy and firm. His eyes sort of switched. Is that the type of thing you're talking about when you use the word fluctuating?
Yes, indeed. This variability in his mental state, in his disorientation, and in his paranoia from almost minute to minute, that certainly happens in a drug-induced state.
And then, as you mentioned, we've heard evidence from Neil Morgan, who knew Mr. Bayo. He was a neighbour of Mr. Bayo, who spoke to Mr. Bayo after the altercation, the fight with his friend. And that seems to have been a calm conversation between the two of them. Again, would that be explained by the variation, the fluctuation that you're talking about?
Yes, indeed. But it may also have been due to a difference in approach. I'm not forgetting that he attacked in a very serious way his best friend, but he then had a reasonably sort of amicable conversation with Mr. Morgan, and went on to a struggle with the police. So the struggle with the police might have been paranoia based. It might have been a person feeling that the police were hostile to him and that his life might be in danger. Where even in what I'm saying is, even in the absence of paranoia, one comes across people, this is well documented in the United States, people who are not psychologically disturbed, but who are approached by the police. I'm talking about black people now, and who then are so terrified of the police that a life and death struggle ensues. And that's to do with a previous experience of racism.
And I'll come back to that in a moment, but you use the words different. It could be a different approach. So we've talked about the fluctuating reaction. We've talked about the description of him switching.
Yes.
The sort of psychological change. In what way when you were talking about a different approach in relation to Mr. Morgan, what was it you were thinking could have been significant there?
Well, Mr. Morgan would probably recognize that Mr. Bayo was in some sort of distressed state, and in a friendly, neighborly way, would have said probably something like, are you all right? Let's have a chat. Would have said something reassuring and reasonable rapport would have been established. I guess Mr. Morgan had the advantage of not being in police uniform.
Indeed, we heard evidence from Mr. Morgan that he'd invited him in to have a cup of coffee and to calm down.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you mentioned just a moment ago racism, experience of that, and we did hear evidence from Mr. Bayo's partner, and she talked about a conversation she'd had some time ago with Mr. Bayo, and in our conversations, and had said Sheikh used to always say to me that about racism and the police, and she described how she was very naive to these things, and he had said, do you know, as a black man, when you are up against the police, it doesn't matter if you have done right or if you have done wrong. The only way you're getting out from a confrontation with the police is if you run. There is no way out as a black man when you're coming up against the police. And so that's maybe not a detailed discussion of the conversation they'd had, Miss Bell and Mr. Bayo, but could that be indicative of someone who's had previously bad experiences with the police?
Yes, I wasn't aware of that at all, but that's exactly what I was referring to when I said that an individual might have been sensitized by one previous negative or multiple previous negative encounters with people in authority, with the police.
And then in that situation where the person is intoxicated by these drugs and is perhaps suffering from this paranoia, if the police then, of course, discharge CS and Pava spray and strike that person with batons, in terms of the state of mind of the person, can you explain to the chair how that their state of mind would develop or evolve as these things happen?
Yeah. Well, a person who is not suffering from a mental illness, who is not intoxicated, but who has a previous experience of racism or is aware of police attitudes to black people. So I'm talking about a person now, a black person, who is not unwell, but they may be very frightened indeed when they're questioned by the police, because they'll be aware that there are occasions when the police have acted excessively or unlawfully in relation to people of color. And that will make them frightened and apprehensive. And if a struggle develops, they might feel this is a life and death struggle. And I think this is one of the reasons for the label superhuman strength. The individual resists because they are truly in fear of their lives. And the more they resist, the more restraint is applied. So it's a terrible vicious circle. Now, that's a person without mental illness and without intoxication. When you have mental illness and or intoxication, as in this case, and where we know that there's paranoia, as we mentioned earlier, these ideas of reference and the suspicion that a friend was in the CID and so on, then the suspicion and the fear are compounded, are multiplied enormously. So the reaction will be even more intense.
And if we've heard evidence of Mr. Bio struggling in an extreme way against the police restraint. So having been brought to the ground by a number of police officers and I quote, actively resisting with extreme force and throwing punches. Is that the type of reaction that someone suffering from psychotic, paranoid, and under the influence of these stimulant drugs, is that the type of reaction you would expect if they're being restrained?
Yes, indeed. So that's in a psychologically abnormal state induced by drugs or mental illness. But I do want to emphasize that black people who are not unwell, talking about men mainly, who are not unwell, but who are inappropriately apprehended, they may struggle to escape because they feel that the outcome for them is going to be very bad. So they may perceive an arrest as potentially a life and death struggle. I'm talking about both people on the one hand with mental illness and or intoxication, but I'm also talking about young black men who don't have an abnormal psychiatric state.
So black men who've experienced discrimination, who see themselves as in a life or death struggle, even without having taken any drugs, would struggle
absolutely
against that. And if someone has taken drugs, that would be an even more extreme reaction by that same person.
Exactly. Right. Yes, that's exactly the point.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask you about something else you said earlier today. You were talking about de-escalation. We've heard evidence from experts in relation to police tactics and restraint. And 2 scenarios were discussed as part of that evidence. Well, 4 actually, but 2 of them involved no engagement as such by the police. 2 of them involved engagement by the police. One scenario was described as de-escalation, and if you can give me a moment, this was a scenario where the officers would engage and negotiate and de-escalate in relation to the person, try to understand what was going on, to allow them to inform decision making about the process, an opportunity to communicate, key to building rapport, and they would attempt to de-escalate, engage and negotiate. If we can call that the de-escalation scenario. And then another scenario being what was known as verbal dominance, or colloquially called a hard stop. An authoritarian approach, wanting to try and control the individual, verbal dominance approach of communication. A methodology of trying to dominate the individual by getting them to comply with instructions, to minimize the risk or minimize the requirement to possibly use other force. So 2 different tactical options, one called de-escalation, one called verbal dominance or a hard stop. And I wonder if you could help the chair understand the difference in those approaches if dealing with someone who is under that intoxication with that paranoid state of mind.
The first approach is the one that mental health workers would use, psychiatrists, mental health nurses, and so on. And we would not make an attempt to dominate by using commands and orders. because it's fairly obvious that it's likely to alienate and antagonize the person. And if they, as they often are, paranoid and suspicious and frightened, that's likely to make them even more frightened. So I would go for the other option, which involves an attempt to listen and not to appear threatening, but to offer reassurance. And as I said earlier, not to appear to be in a hurry, but to give the impression that we have plenty of time to listen to the individual's point of view and to find out what, in particular, what they're worried about, and to see if we can do anything about their worries. So in my statement, I gave an example, which was a person may say, well, I'm very worried because some conspirators are attacking my wife and children at home. And then we as mental health workers might say, well, look, there's something we can do about that. We'll get the social workers to go around to your house now just to check on their safety. And as soon as we've got the news, we'll give it back to you. So that would be an attempt to provide practical reassurance and to respond to the person's false beliefs, but taking them seriously at the same time and doing something about it within our power.
Thank you. And then in your inquiry statement, if I can look at paragraph 66, please. You say, in summary, I state in my 2016 article that there's no evidence that acute behavioural disturbance alone is other than a rare cause of death, and there's no evidence that correctly restrained, behaviourally disturbed patients are commonly at risk of death. The majority of cases will survive arrest, restraint, and being transported to custody or to hospital. I'm interested in any views you have about how significant the manner of dealing with people in these states is in terms of the eventual outcome.
Yes. Well, if you use the de-escalation approach, which we've been discussing, then you're much more likely to have a patient, using the word patient who will be cooperative and who will become less agitated, and who you can establish a rapport with, and indeed who will calm down. The calmer you are, the less physiologically disturbed you are. And so the outcome is likely to be a satisfactory one. If conversely you appear threatening, domineering, dismissive. Dismissive is an important word in this context. If you don't look as if you have the time to listen to what the patient might want to say, then you're going to make the situation worse, and the person will become more agitated and regard you as the intervener, as a threat rather than a source of help and reassurance.
So would that approach exacerbate the symptoms that they are feeling or experiencing?
Yes.
And then I'm also interested in another section of your inquiry statement at paragraph 74. You say, once you've decided that restraint is needed, and I think earlier you recognised that there may be occasions or circumstances where that although you say the final option, that is an option that has to be taken. So once you've decided the restraint is needed, then you need an ambulance straight away. And I'm interested in the significance of obtaining an ambulance straight away. Can you tell me a little more about that? Why would you suggest that?
Because the the restraint process itself, which is often associated with the struggle against restraint, causes the person's physiological system to go into an abnormal state. So it's unlike a typical athletic exercise like running or swimming, etc., where there's a physiological adaptation. When you're struggling against restraint, that's a highly abnormal state, and the physiological response is risky and perilous. So the sooner you get the person to appropriate medical help, and this is where emergency physicians certainly come in, they will be able to assist in correcting the abnormal physiology.
Thank you.
And the way to do that is to get people to hospital, ideally in an ambulance, because the ambulance staff will be able to monitor the individual's heart rate and oxygen level and so on. Just to pick up on something that was mentioned earlier, in my 2015 paper, I said the person should be taken into custody or into A&D, i.e. that's at a time when a place of safety was defined as custody or A&D. So that's out of date. I would now, of course, say they should go be taken straight to A&D by ambulance.
And so if there is a decision taken that restraint is necessary, when would you be recommending that an ambulance is called?
Straight away.
Right. Thank you.
Immediately.
Immediately. Now, finally, the chair has an inquiry statement, and we've heard some evidence from the pathologist in relation to comments and opinions expressed by Dr. Stephen Karch. And my understanding is that you and he are of different disciplines, and you have a divergence of views in relation to excited delirium. And just so that the chair's in no doubt, can you explain the differences between your view and that of Dr. Karch, please?
Yes. As you've just said, I'm a psychiatrist, so I deal with mental illness, and Dr. Karch is a forensic pathologist, and he examines bodies trying to establish cause of death. He has a particular interest, I think, in cardiac causes of death. So I have my area of expertise, which is totally different to his. Where our views have clashed is that he, for many years, has been a strong proponent of excited delirium as a cause of death in custody, and as I've been saying throughout today, I take the opposite view.
And I've read the inquiry statement that he's provided to the inquiry, and just for the avoidance of doubt, I don't understand him to claim to be a forensic pathologist. My understanding is he describes himself as a cardiac pathologist, and my understanding is that he's not carrying out post-mortems, but his particular interest is in cardiac and the heart.
I've read many articles by Stephen Karch, and I think they've, apart from one article in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, the others have all been in American journals which have forensic and or legal in the title. So forensic and legal pathology and variations on those titles.
Right. Well, we have a very detailed inquiry statement from him, and the chair will be able to consider his own experience and qualifications in due course. But thank you very much. Could you give me one moment, please, Dr Lipsedge?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Dr Lipsedge, I'm going to speak to the legal representatives here for a moment, so I'm going to cut the connection with you just now, but don't go away, because I'll come back to you shortly and explain to you what will happen next.
Yes, sir.
Are there any Rule 9 applications? No. Well, perhaps we could have Dr Lipsedge back on as soon as possible. Dr Lipsedge, I've come back to you sooner than I expected to, but I'm able to tell you that there will be no further questions for you.
Yes.
So may I thank you very much for giving evidence to the inquiry. I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to do that. And we're going to rise now for the day, and you'll be free to go about your own business again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.